Rubbish. It's everybody's business. It's big business, and it can be a very dangerous business. It cost one worker here his life.
You don't expect somebody to go to work and be killed.
David's death was probably completely needless. It was tragic. It simply was a death that shouldn't have happened.
I'll never know what happened in those last few minutes. And it'll be with me for the rest of my life. That was my child.
This is the story of David Layland. He was a worker here for Biffa, the company that run this massive rubbish landfill on the outskirts of Belfast. His job was to help deal with the waste we throw away. Tonight on Spotlight, we investigate the failings surrounding his death and hear concern that waste deals made on behalf of councils could be putting workers' safety at risk.
I believe there was a culture of haste. The volume of traffic was quite heavy.
Performance-related clauses tend to put pressure on people, or they incentivise people to do that little bit more, to go that little bit quicker.
It gives me great pleasure to declare that you are my husband and wife.
This is David's wedding. He and his bride Carol starting out on a happy life together. Only weeks after they were married, his new wife would go to his funeral. But at the time, his older brother Ken says they were expecting a bright future.
He was looking forward to having his first children on the Christmas that he got married. I think that's their plans were. They'd start talking about names, and so he was very, very much a family man.
He'd been working hard, putting in the overtime to save for the couple's dream honeymoon. It was something his parents knew he dearly wanted.
He was a big hunk of chunk. He was just a great, big, beautiful boy. A solid, trustworthy young man. He was just gorgeous, you know.
He was just such a little prankster, and he was just so funny. He got on well with people, he loved his family, he worked hard. He just had all the qualities that, he had all the qualities any father would love to have in a son.
David shared that sense of humour with his workmates at Biffa's Mallusk site. But they also knew his serious side. His concern for safe working had earned him an award from company bosses in 2006. He was the site's health and safety officer and had also become site supervisor.
He wanted to work the whole way up to management level. You know, he saw flaws and things that were going on in the site, and he was so proud of himself, with achieving with the health and safety and putting everything in place.
But his family say that in the weeks before his death, David had begun to worry about safety at the site. He confided to his father that he was thinking of leaving.
I know he was concerned with machinery and people mixing. I know he was concerned about being able to be in contact better and to be able to monitor the flow of traffic better.
David's family claimed that he passed those concerns up to management, but that nothing was done about his worries. That's something Biffa denies. It told us it had no record of any such concerns being raised. Managing landfill waste is dangerous. It's a terrain of mountains of rubbish dotted with bulldozers and compactors. Vast amounts of waste are heaved and flattened by these massive machines. David would have known the risks that came with his work. John Dine is a lawyer who has represented companies in the landfill industries. He also sits on a number of trade associations. He hasn't represented Biffa.
If you get clipped by a large machine, you are unlikely to get up again. It's not like being tapped by a car. These machines are heavy and unyielding, and if you make contact with them, it's extremely serious. You're going to either be killed or suffer severe injury. So the risk is enormous.
Tea time on a summer evening in August 2008. David had been at work all day, moving between his office and the landfill face. He had last been seen at lunchtime, chatting to a colleague near the tipping area, and though one worker had asked where he was shortly after that, his workmates only realised he was missing when it was time to go home. One of David's colleagues made the call to his brother Ken.
I knew straight away if David had had any problem or walked out of work, I would have been the first one to know about it. And I drove straight down. I phoned my mate to run round to David's house to bang on the doors and windows to see if he was in.
By the time he got to the site, David's workmates had found his shoes and clothes still in his locker. David's family and friends began to arrive and immediately started to search for him at the tipping zone. Neither of the landfill senior managers was on the site.
My heart sank as soon as I seen it. You know, the smell of excrement and rotten flesh, it was restaurant waste, there was glass, and it was a horrible place to be.
As the light began to fade, they searched over the newly buried waste. David's mother was wearing only flip-flops and had even found herself close to the site's cliff edge.
I just had a deep dread that something was really, really wrong, because David was so responsible. He would never have gone missing. And there was just something really, really wrong.
I could hear voices shouting for David. And I prayed and prayed that he'd slipped and fell and was incapacitated somewhere behind a concrete or something, anything.
Even into the next day, they were still searching, the emergency services having brought specialist equipment on site at around midnight.
At last, some organisations started to come into the search because them boys know what they're doing, you know.
I kept praying that somewhere along, if he was under the ground, there'd be an air pocket. Anything, that he would still be there, but it was getting cold. And I thought, how can we go home and him still be there?
So why had the alarm not been raised earlier on the day David went missing? David Layland hadn't been seen since lunchtime. Some workers had asked where he was, but no call-out was made to check for him. They just hadn't realised he was missing. It's since been discovered that Biffa didn't have a system to do a head count or to monitor people's whereabouts on the job. The man who headed up an investigation by the health and safety executive into David's death told a recent inquest that should have been in place.
The importance of making sure that those people are accounted for is that with the large vehicles, it's always possible that something can happen, and an emergency procedure, head count, etc., that should all be in place to monitor where people are and that nothing has happened to anybody.
Biffa told us that it had never previously had a missing person on any of its sites, and the company does not accept that missing persons presented a foreseeable risk for which an emergency procedure ought to have been devised. Because no one realised he was missing, operations at the site weren't stopped. That meant workers kept dumping and compacting rubbish. For the family, that lack of an emergency plan made finding David even more traumatic.
In my heart I knew something terrible had happened, but in my head I knew that I was the only person on that site that was going to be able to do anything proactive. There was a complete lack of management on that site. It was so evident there was not a procedure put in place.
Certainly on the ground, nobody was aware of what steps to take whenever it emerged that somebody was missing. There was a delay here in actually getting to the stage where he was declared missing. There was last sightings, then it was a period of time passed. But it was conceded at the inquest that really nobody was fully aware of exactly what to do.
With the search into its second day, emergency teams continued to scour the huge site. At 8 p.m, nearly 30 hours after he'd last been seen, a police officer gathered the family together and broke the news. David's body had been found buried under tons of compacted waste.
It was just cries and screams. And amongst all them, one of them was mine, but I knew it was going to happen, but when you hear those words, your life just collapses. And it still feels the same way.
His body was found in the landfill 70 metres from where he'd last been seen that day. He had suffered horrific injuries.
They wanted somebody who would come and identify David's body. And I said, I will. It's my child, I give birth to him. I want to see that it's David. I didn't care what I was going to see. I had to go up and see it. I had to get up. And if I had to get into a hole and pick my child up, I would have done. But I wasn't allowed.
David's family had to try and come to terms with the knowledge that he was dead. What made it even more difficult was that no one could tell what had caused it. The site was sealed as police and investigators tried to find clues as to what had happened.
You couldn't operate. You couldn't function. I couldn't drive. I couldn't think. Couldn't sleep. When I closed my eyes, I'd seen my brother being run over by machinery.
Last year, Biffa was convicted for breaking a health and safety law, but it wasn't found responsible for causing David's death. Exactly how he died has never been established. The judge said that the dangers on the site were both obvious and recognised, and that there was a substantial failure on the part of Biffa's health and safety measures. So what Biffa did in theory was different from what went on in practice.
They had very good policies and procedures, and you would expect with a very big, well-run company like that, the issues that arose on the ground would have been better managed. So yes, it did come as a bit of a surprise that things were in such a state on the ground.
Biffa pleaded guilty to failing to maintain a safe system of work on the day that David died. We asked the company to take part in an interview for this programme, but it turned down our request. In a statement it said it only pleaded guilty because of what a court heard were potential deficiencies on site. The court heard that David's death couldn't be attributed to any of these. But as no one knows how David died, the possibility of establishing which of those potential deficiencies caused his death was always remote. John Dine says the companies have to be robust in making sure their policies are actually being followed.
The greatest mystery is that no one saw anything, and what it really does bring home is that you can have all the systems in the world, but you've got to police them. You've got to make sure that people follow the procedures and the site rules.
A likely explanation for David Layland's death is that he was hit by a large vehicle. In an environment that's already difficult, industry experts agree that there is one key rule to stopping potentially fatal accidents before they happen.
What I would say is that the movement of vehicles and the management of transport are probably the most important single factor at an operational landfill site.
What makes it so tough is that due to the constant dumping, the shape of the ground is always changing. Then there's the traffic. On the day of the accident, 134 lorries went through the gates at the Mallusk site in 10 hours. That's equivalent to one dump lorry every 5 minutes. Then, as now, Biffa holds the contract for almost all the waste from 11 councils around Belfast. In that contract, there's something called a turnaround clause. It means Biffa can be fined if it's taking too long to get lorries on and off its site. If a lorry takes longer than 30 minutes, Biffa can be fined £30 a time. Clauses such as this are widely used in the industry, but concern has been raised about the potential effects they could have.
I believe there was a culture of haste. The volume of traffic was quite heavy. Any occasion I've been there have been queues of vehicles both waiting to enter and to exit the site.
These concerns have never been directly linked to David's death, but the chief safety investigator says that in his opinion they're a bad idea for the industry.
The difficulty that would give rise to is if there's any slowing down in the system, drivers could have the perception that it's worth taking increased risks. People operating the site could have the perception that it's worth taking increased risks.
But Biffa says it doesn't accept that. It says turnaround clauses are common within local authority waste disposal contracts, and that it doesn't accept that they encourage a culture of haste. At the site, lorries would normally roll in from the entrance and pass over a weighbridge. After that, they'd continue down to what's known as a haul road and be held in a queue at traffic lights. When the traffic lights said go, they'd move into position and tip their tons of rubbish in a designated tipping area before driving off again. But on the day that David died, those traffic lights weren't working. This was one of the biggest failings levelled against the company.
My opinion is that the traffic lights were the linchpin to the whole safe system of work. The traffic lights the purpose of them was to hold the bin lorries, the larger lorries coming in with waste, to hold them on the haul road and not let them onto the tipping face.
Biffa accepts the lights were broken that day, but said that lights are not necessary to facilitate the safe movement of traffic on sites of this nature. It added that traffic lights are not commonly used on landfill sites in the UK, and visitors to the site understood to follow hand signals, which are standard practice. Whether standard practice or not, traffic lights were Biffa's primary choice of traffic control at the Mallusk site at that time. The man who investigated the case says that not properly planning for them breaking down was unacceptable.
I can see no good reason why, for example, a reserve set of traffic lights couldn't have been held on that site, given the importance of the traffic lights for the system of work.
In fact, the inquest heard that the lights had been broken for several days. With the lights out of action, workers on the site were forced to rely on using hand signals and eye contact to call dump trucks forward in the tipping area. They did that from inside their own bulldozers.
There's nothing intrinsically wrong in using hand signals, provided the drivers of all the vehicles who are affected by the hand signals understand what they mean. Obviously, a red light means stop, a green light means go. There's not much room for confusion there. With hand signals, there might be.
That system is fraught with all sorts of complications and difficulties. You have complications such as the distance between the bulldozer and the lorry, whether people can pick up the signal, whether they understand the signal.
Biffa's position remains that the system is widespread in the industry. It told us hand signals are considered by the industry to be a safe way of working and staff were trained accordingly. This was and still is the backup system and has been standard practice for many years. Biffa also said that traffic lights are no longer used at the Mallusk site and that as part of safety improvements, two-way radios are now in place to direct lorries. Biffa's site at Mallusk had designated safe areas where people and machines were kept well separated. Workers attended regular meetings to be told where the tipping area would be and where the safe zones were. On the day he died, a safe zone was where David was last seen. The inquest heard that workers were taking routes and shortcuts across the site that they shouldn't have been using.
Well, they've got designated pathways, and the workers who were supposed to be using them, rather than taking shortcuts, should have been controlled, monitored, and if needs be, disciplined. Because ultimately, it's human nature to take a shortcut, but it's all about the culture and ethos of the organisation. Things are done for a reason, and if the workers are not using those pathways, then that's a serious matter.
A lack of both enforcement and a simple alternative was another basic flaw in the way the site was working that day.
There wasn't robust systems in place to monitor how people were getting up to the workplace. They shouldn't have walked, they should have been taken round in a jeep.
The HSE says the jeep usually used by Biffa workers to get around was off-site at times on the day of David's death. Workers were trekking across the site to get to their machines or back to the offices. and it was heard that they were taking routes that came close to active tipping areas where machines or dangerous ground might be encountered. Biffa responded to us saying, "In the absence of a vehicle for this purpose, dedicated safe walkways are available which all staff were trained to use. Access to the tip head on foot on dedicated routes is considered to be a safe system." More than 3 years after David's death, it's still uncertain how he came to die that day. Despite finding flaws in Biffa's systems at the time of his death, the Health and Safety Executive didn't issue formal demands for improvement. But lead investigator Louis Burns has no doubt that there were flaws in its work practices.
Well, the failings were serious. Essentially, the landfill operation is a transport operation. It's the management of vehicles. The failings were serious, in my opinion, because the control measures needed were so simple.
Biffa says it has since made positive changes to the system at the Mallusk landfill site, including new headcount arrangements, CCTV, and more attention to traffic management. So how dangerous is it to work in waste? Well, in terms of being struck by a vehicle, waste management alongside water and sewerage is in one of the riskiest categories for places of work. The Health and Safety Executive says that over the last 5 years in Great Britain, 1 in every 700 workers in that category has been injured, and in the year David died, 10 waste management workers lost their lives. John Dine says, however, that the safety record of the waste industry should be seen in perspective.
Compared to other industries such as construction and agriculture, I would suggest the record is actually quite good. But that is relative.
Biffa has been convicted 5 times in the last decade for health and safety failings after deaths on its sites across the UK. 3 of those, including David's, involved workers. 2 arose after the deaths of members of the public. In total, it's been fined over £500,000. David's father says he feels that the £60,000 Biffa was fined after his son's death wasn't enough.
That's not even a slap on the wrist. You know, I mean, that is, how trivial is, you know, a person's life?
The fine was one of the largest imposed here for a health and safety breach, and the highest that's ever been levelled was £100,000. Fines in England for similar offences, though, can be much bigger, and that's something which concerns the union David was part of.
It made me wonder, is the value of a life in Northern Ireland any less of that of a life in any other part of the UK?
Do you think it would focus companies' minds here a little more if fines were maybe higher?
I think it would do, yes. There's no doubt about that. The only thing I would say is the ability to pay does come into play. But yes, if the fines were higher or in line with those in GB, it would certainly focus people's minds.
David's father says he's left with more questions than answers. Earlier this month, he brought his safety concerns to the Environmental Health Committee at Belfast City Council.
As far as I'm concerned, it just seems to be a purely financial matter, and council's trying to save as much taxpayers' money as they possibly can. And to be honest, I don't think they take into consideration the health and safety aspect and the effect it has on people.
Despite the death of David Layland, the ARC21 councils awarded a fresh contract to Biffa to process their waste in November last year. Belfast City Council says the committee received assurances from ARC21 that compliance with health and safety requirements had been taken into account when awarding the contract. Remember, ARC21 is the consortium of 11 councils in the Greater Belfast area under which Biffa operates its landfill site at Mallusk. ARC21 says that previous convictions of bidders were not the subject of a specific score in the evaluation of tenders. It says the process focuses on ensuring that bidders actively promote a positive approach to health and safety and could demonstrate that they are competent to manage health and safety standards. In John Dine's experience of the waste industry, though, prosecutions against a company can have a commercial effect.
In my experience, people who supply services do not want to have prosecutions convictions or any form of mark against their good repute and character, because it's not good for business. Its ability to tender for contracts with local authorities and so forth. This is not great news from a commercial point of view. I'm sorry to sort of look at the commerciality side, but fundamentally, any prosecution scores against you.
In the tender competition last year, Biffa came up with the lowest price for the ARC21 group, saving it almost £500,000 over the course of the deal. For Biffa, the contract could be worth £5.4 million. But the new contract still contains a turnaround clause. When Derek visited the council, he said he was warmly received, but his message was clear.
I said to them about their part in issuing tenders, but stop looking at how much money you can save by going for Company A instead of Company B. And I said, if you go for Company A, look at their health and safety record.
ARC21 doesn't believe the penalty fines affect safety. It says the 30-minute turnaround clause is not unusual, and it typically takes a contractor 16 minutes to receive, weigh and empty a vehicle's waste. It doesn't believe the clause encourages a culture of haste. And Biffa doesn't think there's a problem either, saying turnaround times are not considered to be a safety issue. But the industry lawyer says that such clauses can encourage bad and potentially unsafe habits to develop.
Certainly I would frown against any performance-related clauses, because they do then tend to put pressure. Either they put pressure on people, or they incentivise people to do that little bit more, to go that little bit quicker, and possibly to bend the rules to get the job done quicker. I don't like them personally, but I can't sit here and criticise them because the feedback I'm getting from my clients are that they don't see that as a particular issue or a problem for them.
The likelihood is I'll go to my grave without knowing what happened to David.
Because there's no time to say goodbye or to hold him. This is the closest I can get to him.
Biffa described David as a well-liked and valuable member of the team and said it gave sincere condolences to his family. What Ken and the family say they want to hear is an apology for the failures in its systems at the time David died.
Whenever you smile with your kids, you have a massive pain because you automatically think of David. Lost something I can never get back.
We can't get beyond it. This has just completely destroyed us. We can't move on. How can we ever move on?
The pain of losing David will never leave his family, and the waste industry here faces questions of its own.
Clearly something went wrong that day. Everyone wants answers, they're just not going to get them.
For the future of workers like David, finding them is vital.